Hi, my name is Reed Silverne. The name of this show is Fed Pride. The reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and proud of it. Nobody in my agency or any other agency of the federal government has reviewed or approved what I'm about to say. And the main reason is, even I don't know what I'm about to say. Today I'm going to talk about a number of different things. And there's just so much going on in the world. But what's not going on? There's not that much going on domestically because we're between the elections and the long national comedy or nightmare, as the case may be, of the Lewinsky situation is over. But there are a lot of things that are happening. Among them are the pre-positioning for the election. And what is that? Basically, it looked like, and it still kind of looks like, the two major parties, Democrat and Republican, are crowning their respective candidates. And as they crown and place the crown on the heads of George W. Bush for the Republicans and Al Gore, sitting vice president for the Democrats, it's all over. There's nothing else to talk about. There won't be much news until after the conventions when they go head to head. However, even though there's a bunch of dwarfs and gnomes who are out against George W. Bush just announced today that he's raised $50 million, $50 million for the presidency. And there's John McCain. People hear a little bit about him, about campaign finance reform, but not much. Gary Bauer, the Christian candidate. There's Keyes, who's another Christian candidate or very, very right-wing candidate. There's a whole bunch of candidates. They're coming out of the woodwork. One of those candidates is Pat Buchanan, who's now threatening to go over to the Reform Party. And there seems to be a brewing fight in the Reform Party that's almost more interesting than what's going on in the major parties. But among the Democrats, Al Gore, the sitting vice president, has been faring quite badly in the polls. Now, a lot of people say, well, that doesn't matter, who cares? Polls don't mean anything. It's a year and a quarter before the election. But of course, every time a candidate says polls doesn't mean anything, that means they're behind. You don't see George W. Bush, who's ahead of Gore, ahead of most any other candidate, 20, 30 points ahead of any other Republican candidate, say, you know, polls don't count, they don't mean a thing. He's thinking, yeah, polls are great when they're on my side. But there's Bill Bradley. Bill Bradley is a former basketball player. In fact, I remember when I was a kid, he was one of the great basketball players. I believe he was a Knick. And big, tall guy, very, very bright. He was a Rhodes Scholar, just like Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar. And he went into basketball. He came in a basketball scholarship, and then he went to play in the NBA. He had a magnificent career, and he was one of the great players who ever lived. After he graduated, or after he left basketball, kind of graduate from basketball, instead of just fading away or becoming a sportscaster, he went into the Senate, became a senator from New Jersey, and he was a senator for many, many years, and just quit 2 years ago, and now he's running for president. And he's a very, very bright guy, a little bit too liberal for my taste and maybe some other people, but very, very bright, and most importantly, he's more of a centrist than he is a left-winger or a right-winger. And just like George W. Bush is a centrist. He's not a right-winger. He doesn't believe government is evil. He believes in compassionate conservatism. He's kind of at the center of his party and hoping that he'll just sweep through everything else. Well, Al Gore is sitting there as vice president. Al Gore has a lot of things against him. One of the things is he's looked at as being stiff, uncharismatic, not too bright, and there he is, a sitting vice president during the Clinton administration. The good part about being vice president in the Clinton administration, economically, probably the most successful administration in recent history. Why do I say that? Unemployment for the last number of years, 2-3 years, has been the lowest since the 1960s, 30, 40 years. When unemployment is around 4.4%, on top of that, inflation is down. The last time unemployment was down, inflation was creeping up. Now inflation is 2.5%. Stock market has quadrupled in the last 6 years. That has increased national wealth by a tremendous amount. In fact, increased national wealth by 4 times, or at least the part of the national wealth in the stock market. Now, after stalling in the early 90s, even the real estate market is going up. That's more national wealth. People are feeling richer, they're feeling better, and Al Gore, as vice president, has sat there and reigned over this wave of prosperity, unlike anything America's experienced since some of the booms after the Civil War. Why do I say that? In the 60s, there was prosperity, tremendous prosperity, but in the 60s, the unemployment was in the 4 and 5%, but inflation was leading up, and there was a war in Vietnam that was upsetting people. And after the war in Vietnam, before that, there was a civil rights struggle. So the 60s is a very unsettled decade, even though it was a relatively prosperous decade. So it's been a long time since we've had a decade like the 90s and like the Clinton years. Basically, people look back on the Clinton years probably with a snicker on their face about the president who got caught in a sex scandal. And however, it'll be looked back on as the era of the internet, the era of the personal computer, kind of like the way people looked at the end of the last decade of the last century as being the good old days. The only problem was, from 1896 to 1900, there was one of the worst depressions in American history. So all of that nostalgia was unfounded. But it looks like there might be a lot of nostalgia for this era that we're in. Crime is down, even though they have had some mass killings in the schools and in the workplaces. The crack epidemic is almost over. There's a lot of good things that have happened in the 90s. Is Clinton responsible? It's hard to say. Is Clinton a subject of laughter and merriment and disdain and disgrace in some areas? Absolutely. Did Clinton's main opposition, the Gingrich Revolution, collapse? Yes, it did. He outlasted all of them. However, that doesn't mean that all of that good feeling is being pinned on his successor. In fact, all the resentment that occurred during the Clinton administration, all of the lingering anxieties from the early 90s when there were layoffs, seem to be focusing back on Al Gore. People are looking for a change. People are done. Clinton seemed like he was a little foolish, a little stupid, a little racy sometimes, but in actuality, he's also seemed to the people to be the kind of guy who was either just very, very lucky or very, very smart to preside over the kind of prosperity that he had. And of course, the biggest problem, that economic problem that occurred at the beginning, this incredible deficit, $290 to $300 billion a year, 5% of the GNP, was being borrowed every single year just to cover the government's bill every single year, has now turned around, completely turned around, turned into a surplus. The Republicans pretty much have dropped their tax cut. That's their main issue. And now they're going in to the year 2000 without much going for them, except a popular, moderate candidate in George W. Bush. And there seems to be, at least among the Republican establishment, which has been roiled by radicalism, by the Gingrich Revolution, by anti-government feeling, and by Christian fundamentalism, and all of these other movements that have roiled the Republican Party in the last 5 or 6 years. They're looking for a moderate Republican who can carry back the presidency. And the presidency that Republicans have felt for a long time, ever since the Nixon era, that they really deserve. Because let's face it, even though the House and the Senate were Democratic during the 70s and 80s, it seemed like during that period from 68 on, that the calculus of electoral politics was really for the Republicans as far as the presidency was concerned. The South was relatively conservative. The Northeast was relatively liberal. The West was relatively conservative. And that favored the Republicans throughout. Now, meanwhile, we have Al Gore. What is Al Gore's reputation? Whether it's true or not, what is his reputation? His reputation, first of all, he's uncharismatic. He's stiff. He doesn't move. He looks like a wooden pole. That's his first part of his reputation. And even as he jokes and even as he tries to go on David Letterman and break ashtrays and so on and so forth, he hasn't quite broken that. Second problem with Gore is that Gore is looked at as a radical environmentalist. He wrote some environmental books that had some quotes that can be taken out of context that really seemed a little bit silly. Is the environment a problem? Yes, it is. Is there global warming? There appears to be. Is it the threat to America that has to be settled right now by shutting down cars, by completely changing the way we use energy? No, it's not something that's threatening the nation immediately, the way an imminent war would, or the way the hurricane in North Carolina would. Although a lot of people might blame the fact that we've been having a lot of hurricane damage and so on and so forth on global warming, changes in climate pattern. So Al Gore is looked at as kind of a radical environmentalist. Even though he's trying to take that moderate middle of the road and to appear to be the moderate candidate, to a lot of people, he appears to be the radical environmental candidate, not moderate at all. And meanwhile, we have this very, very calming, very, very bright, very, very almost pedantic Bill Bradley coming out there saying, look, I am a guy that you can trust. I'm just a regular guy. I'm a jock. I played basketball. I'm one of the people, and yet I'm for the people. But I'm not a radical. I'm not out there on the left. I'm not out there on the right. I'm the kind of guy that you can trust to keep this prosperity going for 8 more years. And it's starting to work. He's raising almost as much money as Al Gore. Al Gore has all the official Democratic Party machines behind him, and yet has only raised a little bit more money than Al Gore. Unlike George W. Bush, who has the Republican establishment behind him, raised $50 million. All the other Republican candidates combined isn't anywhere near half that. So Bradley's really coming up ahead. And right now in the latest polls, just among Democrats, Bradley is now dead heat even with Al Gore among Democrats. And you can imagine that he would be more popular among the independents and even Republicans because he seems more moderate than Al Gore does. What are some of their strategies? He wants to win in New Hampshire, California, but most importantly, New York. Now, Bradley just got the endorsement of Moynihan, the powerful ex-senator from New York State. Basically one of the kingmakers in New York State. So that was a big deal. He's doing everything he can to delay the sense of inevitability in the election. That's what the Republican candidates are doing in the Republican Party and failing miserably. In the Republican Party, it just seems like there's only one candidate and a bunch of little gnomes kind of nipping at his heel. But in the Democratic Party, Bradley is seen as being the guy in the middle. He wants to buy time to convey his message, and he is looking for a national, slowly moving movement that slowly builds up until it looks like Gore is just a loser. And Gore has been consistently 15, 20 points behind George W. Bush in all the polls. And it seems like the polls are so consistent about this situation that it looks like it's not going to change once the actual election starts and they get their positions out. Why? Because George W. Bush is not going to put out positions. George W. Bush is basically going to run saying, I am the center, I am the middle, I'm a Republican, and yet I'm not going to upset the apple cart like Gingrich and all these other guys. And Bradley is over there on the Democratic side, basically taking that same position, but a little bit more liberal. And of course, he's a Democrat. You can expect him to be a little bit more liberal. They argue that the centrist and independent voters of New Hampshire see that Bradley's more liberal, which is a favorable for Gore. But Gore, the Democratic Party is set up in such a way that 20% of the delegates to the final thing are going to be what they call super delegates. They'll be party leaders, they'll be congressional people, as opposed to people selected through the primary process. Why they did that, I'm not absolutely sure, but they did. That's supposed to favor Gore. I don't think it will, because I think that unless Gore gets his act together real soon, and I'm talking about the next couple months, way before Iowa or New Hampshire, unless he can catch up to George W. Bush, Gore is going to look like a loser. And if he looks like a loser, the congressional party that respects Bradley quite a bit are going to switch over to Bradley's side. So I think we're going to see something very, very interesting and a good possibility of it, although I could be wrong, and I've been wrong before, and I'll probably be wrong again. But I think that Bradley has a real good chance of overturning Gore's nomination. I don't think that any of the Republicans have much of a chance to overthrow George W. Bush. Meanwhile, another major earthquake, 7.6, in where? A place I've been talking about a lot lately, Taiwan, the center of the conflict in Asia. Another incredible development in Asia. We have now offered to the North Koreans to drop our sanctions against them if they fail or they don't test a long-range nuclear missile. They don't need to test the missile. Just the fact that they have it is deterrent enough. And here they can get concessions just for not testing a missile. This is something that Pakistan could have done, gotten a big edge against India in South Asia, but they chose not to do it. And that seems to be happening. Now, whether they're going to just turn around and surprise test the missile, which would upset all the politics of Asia, probably the markets in Asia, which are finally coming back, that could be a very, very bad thing. Meanwhile, Taiwan, one of the strongest economies in the world, has come back, bounced almost completely back from the Asian flu a couple of years ago. Terrible earthquake, 1,500 killed. Not quite as bad, 7.6 on the Richter scale, not quite as bad in damage as the earthquake up in Turkey, but very, very interesting. The epicenter is like 60, 70 miles away, and yet it killed over 1,000 people in the capital of Taipei. Taipei's at the top of the island. The epicenter is right here, kind of in the middle. What does this mean for us? We'll find out. The Chinese have offered to send teams to help the Taiwanese out in earthquake relief. Taiwan has not accepted that, but they thank the Chinese government instead. There's been a lot of tension between Taiwan and China because the president of Taiwan, in the middle of a new election campaign, has been kind of making noises that he wants to declare his independence. He wants to be treated state-to-state relationship as opposed to as one China, where he is just the governor, basically, of a renegade province. This has really upset the Chinese government. Chinese government has been on edge. There's been a lot of economic problems in China in the last couple of years. There's a lot of unrest in the outer areas of China, and the Chinese have been going after a small sect that practices Tai Chi, or Qigong, which is like Tai Chi. So there's a lot of trouble in that part of the world. What's going to happen next? It's hard to say. Indonesia, which is just south of China, has a little area called East Timor, and there's just been a new peacekeeping group put in there. Are Americans involved? Yes, 200. But right now, most of the Americans, except for two, are not on the ground in East Timor. They're at Darwin, Australia, which is actually, from what I hear, a pretty nice place to be. That's kind of the tropical part of Australia, the Crocodile Dundee part, you know, with real tropics. So there's a lot happening throughout the world, and a lot of things that could cause one crisis here, one crisis there, throughout the world. And where are we? Right now, we have basically 7,500 troops in Kosovo. We still have 5,000 troops in Bosnia. We have military forces throughout the world. And right now, the UN has been trying to convince the Iraqis to allow inspectors back into their country, try to keep them from developing nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. And Saddam Hussein, sensing weakness on our part, has basically said no to all of the alternatives. One of the alternatives put out by Russia and France, who have been looking to lift the sanctions with Iraq, because Iraq owes them a lot of money and they need that foreign exchange. The Iraqis rejected a complete lifting of sanctions just to allow a few teams of inspectors into the country. Fortunately, that hasn't happened yet, because if they do lift the sanctions, then the Iraqis will be able to pour out millions of barrels of oil, make a lot of money, and start really rebuilding in earnest. One of the things that have kept them back is the fact that there's only a very small amount of oil that they've allowed the Iraqis to ship out, and that oil has been sent in as food and medicine exchanged beforehand and not as cash. If the Iraqis ever get their hands on what they're used to, $10 billion a year of oil cash, they're not going to use that for their people. They're going to build nuclear weapons, missiles, chemical weapons, and bacteriological weapons, and they seem to have hidden at least the biological weapons, from what we understand, from what Butler and the other set of inspectors are saying, and are very, very dangerous. And meanwhile, we have an entire Navy in the Middle East. We're still flying over Iraq. We're still knocking out various anti-aircraft targets. And we still have 2 no-fly zones. We have aides in southern Turkey that are helping the Kurds. We have a contingents in Kuwait right now, protecting the Kuwaitis. So we are very, very overextended. Federal Commission predicts an increasing threat of terrorism. A federal commission headed by Warren Rudman, who's an ex-senator, and Gary Hart, an ex-senator involved in a sex scandal, says that we are more vulnerable than ever to international terrorism, and that they can attack cities with germs on the East Coast. The other thing that we're very vulnerable to is, now that the internet is becoming so powerful, now that all kinds of government agencies, private companies are doing business on the internet, are putting their procedures out of the internet, in fact, are using the internet and intranets to do business, we are much more vulnerable than we've ever been to cyber-terrorism. In other words, they knock out the internet, they knock out the communication nodes, we could be in real trouble within the country. Banking system, the money system, the defense system, all different systems are very, very vulnerable, more vulnerable than they've been in the past to cyber attacks, super viruses, and even attacks on major servers and major switching stations, which could happen. These are all dangers, and these are pointed out by this group. They also said that we need to reorganize National Security Council, CIA, FBI, everything that was put together after World War II, and the Defense Department, in order to address these new threats. My name is Reed Silverne. The name of the show is Fed Pride. The reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and proud of it. Thank you.